Hello and welcome back to Confessions of a Reformer. I'm your host, Mike Mayashiro, and we are doing a deconstruction series. I've got a special guest for you today. We've got guests. I'm very excited for you to hear from Savannah Carreno. She and I just spent some time getting to know each other before this conversation. I'm very excited for us. I'm going to get to know her currently with you. I've been following her for a while. I love her content. Can't wait for her to get to share with you. Savannah, would you care to say hello?
Hello, everybody. I'm so excited to be here and a part of this conversation. Honored to even be considered. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. I'm honored that you're here. So I know that we talked about this briefly and we both hate this question, but just for the sake of people who are newly being introduced to you, who are you? What do you do in the world? What's your work like?
I'm so glad you asked because we both love that question. What do you do? As two people that have very complex, weird, unorthodox careers. I just love this question. So I am Savannah Ray Carreno. I run a DEI and public speaking consultancy called Please Elaborate. We work with businesses and individuals on their public speaking and communication skills. And we also work with businesses on diversity, equity, and inclusion and leadership training for their staff. And so that's my day-to-day business. I started that, worked on it all of last year, and we launched in October. And so we're working with some incredible people right now, and it's amazing, and I love it, and it is giving me all the gray hairs and also all the joy. On top of that, I also am I guess you could say, a content creator. And I'm sorry, I know everyone's rolling their eyes. So you're an influencer. I create content looking at the Bible from an academic perspective. I study religion. I myself am not religious. I don't identify with any religion. I used to. That's a story I'm sure we'll get into. But right now, I study religion, specifically modern American Christianity, the history of interpretation of the Bible, and how that has influenced American culture. And so those are my fractured life, looking at religion and culture, and also working in public speaking and diversity, equity, and inclusion, running a consultants agency. So yeah, that's me.
What a dichotomy. Yeah, that's awesome. I can't imagine why I have you here for this conversation.
So sorry.
Well, listen, I've got so many questions. I'm so intrigued. So I want to hear your backstory, your origin story. How did you get here? So it sounds like, especially just judging from your content, you were raised Christian, you grew up in the church. Is that true? What was your relationship with religion in whatever form? And then I also want to know, how did you get to the point where you're like, yeah, this isn't for me. I'm not part of this.
So this actually comes as a shock to a lot of people. I was not raised in the church. I was not raised Christian. I know. And I was born and raised in Nashville, of all places, and the Bible Belt, and not raised Christian. I know, very crazy. And I say that my family was Christian by tradition. It's the South. So you're praying before dinner. We'd go to church for Christmas and Easter. We were the CEOs, Christmas and Easter only. I went to a Church of Christ high school. That is the bane of my existence and the root of most of my trauma. But so, and just to give a little bit of a backstory, while not, pandering on with my life story, my upbringing was actually very pivotal because my relationship with religion was interesting as a kid, because I didn't grow up in a religious home. It wasn't something where we were talking about theology and Jesus and the gospel growing up. We celebrated Christmas. We were told the story of Jesus, like most, kids around the holidays in the Bible Belt are, but, we weren't going to church. I wasn't reading my Bible. My parents weren't stewarding me in a theological way of life. But I went to this Church of Christ school. And in that school, you would go to chapel and, you never saw a woman speak. I was always told that, I was going to hell because I was wearing a leotard, because I had dance after school, and I would wear my leotard and my tights to jump in the car, and a teacher would pull me aside and be like, you can't dress like that. That's sending a man into sin. And I was like, it's sending what into where? I don't, It just did not make sense to me. I'm like, I'm a dancer. I'm going to college for this. This is my profession. And you're picking on my costume. Like, my rational brain just couldn't make sense. And then, seeing women be treated so differently than men, seeing that in high school really painted a picture of Christianity that I didn't want to be a part of. And so I never even, not only was I not growing up in a Christian home, I was being shown a perspective of Christianity that I didn't like. And so I was like, no, I'm fine with this. I'm not doing this. I had no interest in it. And then my mom got really, really sick. She was diagnosed with lupus, and over time, she developed a drug and alcohol addiction. She passed away a couple of years ago. But, through all of my part of middle school, all of high school, college, up until, the last 2 years, it's been a struggle for my family. But in those initial years when she was diagnosed with lupus, I started to seek out religion as a coping mechanism, as a lot of people do. And I think there is nothing wrong with that. And it is completely normal. You hear so many stories about people that weren't religious, and then all of a sudden they lose someone, or they witness a miracle, or their daughter is healed from cancer, and all of a sudden it leads them down this path of spiritual introspection. And that happened to me. And it was this moment, you're a kid, I'm in high school, you revert back to all of those things your teachers have been telling you of, like, when times are hard, you turn to the Bible. And I picked up a Bible, I started reading it. When people are going through an emotionally challenging season, I think it's completely normal psychologically and spiritually to want to seek that spiritual introspection. You hear it all the time with parents who have a kid that overcomes cancer, or maybe they lose a kid, or someone loses someone that they love, and then they seek out religion to gain some sort of clarity or some sort of semblance of certainty, or explanation as to why bad things happen. I talk a lot about that on my account, this idea of religion being this kind of balm to the wound of confusion in the world. We don't know why people die. We don't know why there's so much violence in the world, or why there's a hurricane. But when you lean on religion and you lean on a kind of a spiritual foundation, your faith and understanding, and you have your Bible or your sacred text that kind of gives you some semblance of understanding of why bad things happen, I think it's only natural that humanity seeks that out. And I think it's beautiful. And it's one of the wonderful things that religion offers us, is this anchor, this kind of floaty in the storms of life. It really keeps us afloat and keeps our mind clear when we otherwise might not have been able to. And so I really did the same thing as a 14-year-old, 15-year-old, in high school, seeing my mom and being told there's a 30% chance that she's going to make it through the night. I turned to religion because that's what my teachers were telling me in school. I would remember teachers saying, in times of trouble, in times of sorrow, you turn to Jesus, you turn to the gospel, you turn to your Bible. And so I went out and got a Bible and read that Bible cover to cover in high school, because I was so desperate for something, but also so curious. And as I was reading this Bible through high school, I realized a lot of what I was reading was actually really contradictory to the vision of Christianity that I was being presented with in high school. And so there was this discrepancy of, like, this Bible seems very, very clear on, it's a story of love. It's a story of compassion and empathy. And what I'm being presented with in 2009 is exclusivity, legalism, doctrine, and hatred, and leaving people out, exclusion. So I wrestled with that and really kind of had this weird relationship with religion where it was more curiosity. And anyone who knows me knows that I am very obsessive when it comes to these kinds of things. And seeing that what I was reading was not matching up with what I was seeing, I needed to know why. And so that's why I started that. It kind of sparked that interest in religion. And that spark really carried me through college as well. And that's when I started my friend invited me to church, and I would go to a church there. I had a great church community. We went regularly. I volunteered. And as I'm doing that, I'm also studying scripture and kind of looking at and wrestling with some weird things that don't make sense. And then a dean pulled me aside and said, "Have you ever thought about going to seminary for your MDiv? You have a passion for this." It was kind of coming, people were kind of realizing, leaders in my life are realizing that I was a good orator. And they said, you really have a great way of speaking and communicating your thoughts. Have you ever thought about going into preaching? And the church that I was going to, I saw a lot of women preachers, and I just thought, yeah, I would actually love to do that. So went to seminary, took all of those preaching classes, but also had an emphasis on culture and religion, graduated, became a pastor, preached a little bit, but it was really hard for women to get on that pulpit. Even churches that say they're egalitarian, it's because they let a woman preach 3 times a year. It's like saying you're diverse, but you only have a Black pastor on it, okay, or something. It's just like, okay. So not the same thing, but just in terms of tokenism, it's really what it felt like. It's like, let's have a woman up there just to say that we're egalitarian. And so it was just very strange. And that's a real fast track kind of vision, but
Yeah.
it started, my relationship with religion started as completely outside of it, not being raised being raised religious, but then going to a religious school, having a sort of crisis in my life that led me to religion, wrestling with the Christianity I was seeing versus the faith I was reading about, that curiosity carried me through college, getting more involved in the church and really becoming what I would describe as a really devout Christian for years. Really engaged in the community, went into seminary, fully committed to the faith. And then after a couple of years as a pastor, realizing I think I really am interested in religion as a whole. And I began to see the beauty of all religions. And I could not exclusively commit to Christianity. And in doing that, it meant I wasn't a Christian. And I couldn't commit to any one religion, and just found the beauty and the value in all of it. And that's kind of what led me to today, a more agnostic approach to religion, but an absolute respect and wonder for its role in society. That's kind of the Savannah arc, the character arc of me and my relationship with religion.
Yeah, totally. Cool. Thanks for sharing that. That's so interesting. When it comes to you being a pastor and then choosing to leave the ministry, Christianity, whatever, was there anything in particular in your circumstances or events that took place that helped trigger that decision? Because that's kind of an emotional decision, right? And it's like a big life change. So like, was there something that catalyzed that transition?
Yes, definitely. I realized I gave you a really 10,000-foot approach to
Yeah.
that first answer, hoping we could go deeper on some of these areas.
Oh, let's
There's
go.
nothing we hate more than a 10-minute answer to something. So I try and keep it somewhat brief. But yeah, I think yes and no. The reason that I no longer identify as a Christian is not because of any actions done by people in the Christian community. While that definitely pushed me, it wasn't the reason. And I say that because a lot of time, I don't think it's a fair reason to say I left the faith because I didn't like how some people in the faith treated me.
Mm.
Because no matter what you believe, there's always going to be people that don't treat you right in any sort of community. There's going to be people that share my ideas of religion that don't like me or treat me unfairly. And so saying that I left the faith because the people in the faith didn't treat me right, because there were plenty that did. Most of the Christians that I know personally, that are friends of mine, are incredible people, are some of the nearest and dearest people in my life. And there were a few that were abusive. There were a few that were manipulative and took advantage of their power. And that's going to be in any place you work. That's not because it was, a Christian place. While I know that the Christian space gets away with a lot of behaviors, and we'll get into that in another day or time. But I just want to be really clear about that the reason that I left wasn't because people treated me poorly. It was simply because I could no longer commit to Christianity exclusively. And I didn't need for there to be a God. And I say that not to sound brash, is that the word? Not to sound brash or crass, but I didn't need there to be a Messiah. I don't need that. It didn't, to me, I was totally okay with Christianity being a beautiful, wonderful religion. And at the same time, if we found out, tomorrow that Jesus was a great real nonfiction character person, but he wasn't the Messiah. He was just a really cool guy that people documented and people thought he was. If that came out, I would be okay with that. Mm. And that was kind of the light bulb moment for me, where I thought that to me, to call myself a Christian and also believe and not need Jesus is an insult to Christians. If someone is a Christian and I say, oh, I'm also a Christian, but I don't believe in the Messiah, that totally dilutes and controls the narrative and tries to take away from the story of someone who is a devout Christian, who believes that Jesus is the Messiah. And I don't want to do that. And so I stepped out of that scene just knowing that I didn't need it, and really recognizing that Jesus was someone that, fictional or non-fictional, someone I can learn from in this sacred text. And similar to other pivotal stories in our lives that we read and we hear about, it's not is it real? Is it not real? It's what is it telling me? And how can this person's life that I'm reading about positively influence my life? What changes do I need to make when I read the story of the woman at the well? When I read the story of the Good Samaritan, regardless of whether or not Jesus was real or not, the message is you help someone in need, regardless of how different they are from you. And that can apply to anyone everywhere all of the time. And so really that's how I approached the Bible and how I started looking at scripture. And there were definitely some instances that made it easier for me to walk away from Christianity. Had I been at a church community that really supported me as a woman, really supported my vision and aspirations in the church, and was an inclusive and welcoming environment, it would have been really hard for me to leave the faith, but I still would have done it. Mm. Because some of the environments I was in were very exclusive and manipulative and harmful and really hurt me to a deep level, I still left the faith. It was just a lot easier. It's almost like when you know you need to break up with someone, and it's harder to break up with them when they're so nice, but when they're rude and mean and some words that I won't say on here, it makes it so much easier to break up with them. You're going to break up with them no matter what, but it helps when they're mean to you. It helps if you're mad at them. Yeah. So that's really what it was. I was going to leave, and I think I have been more of an agnostic for longer than I realize. And I really want to emphasize that it is not because of any one person's actions that I left the faith. It is simply almost of me bowing out of a community that I could no longer align with. I was having to sacrifice and deny too many parts of myself. And I didn't want to do that. And I didn't want to ask Christians to do the same. And I'm okay with it. While other Christians think that I'm going to hell, that's okay. Everyone always thinks someone's going to hell. We're all going to hell in the handbasket. And so not letting that get to me is my own personal journey. But yeah, that's kind of my journey with that. I have the utmost respect for the Christian community and also am intrigued and fascinated by it.
Nice. Cool. Thank you for sharing that. Question for you so as you were like processing through, so in my mind, what I'm hearing is you were an aggressive learner. You like dove into the text, pulling apart like the exegesis and the hermeneutics and all the things. And as you were doing that, I'm assuming you came across maybe more definitive, specific things throughout your learning that were more compelling to you maybe they're compelling enough for you to question fundamental components of Christian dogma. If that's true, would you care to share any of the things that stood out to you that were like, hey, this, feels noteworthy, like enough that intellectually I can't have my integrity and pretend like this is still acceptable at the same time, or,
That's a great question. I think one of the first moments that I had with that was the story of the Cushite man. And I forget what book it's in, but I'll maybe you can link it or I'll look it up as we're talking, but I want to make sure that it's in the Old Testament. But that was one of the first stories that a professor told our class. They said, look, this story of the Cushite man has been used to perpetuate racism. And they gave examples, in textbooks of how this story was used to perpetuate the idea that Black people were lesser human than white and light-skinned people. And that was the first time that I really had these gut feelings that something wasn't matching up, but I only had myself and my own resources and curiosity. But once I got to grad school, these professors provided tangible examples like that. And that was one of the first ones where they gave an example and said, this story, which is saying that does a Cushite, know that he's Black, basically is what it's saying, know his stripes, all of these different metaphors for different translations. But then showing me documents where that passage had been used to perpetuate the idea that white people were superior. And I'm in the class thinking, why has nobody been talking about this? And why have we not tried to reconcile this? And why have we swept this under the rug? I mean, I've read the Bible multiple times and have been in a Christian church now going 3 days a week, volunteering 12 hours a week for 4 years out of undergrad school. And now I'm in seminary and I'm just now hearing about this. And asked a lot of my friends who had grown up in the church, and they were like, no, I've never heard of that. And I was like, what? And it was because this story and this ideology had never been reconciled. It had simply just been pushed aside. And that left a lot of ripple effects. And so that's one example.
Is
Another was,
this, are you talking about the Cushite in 2 Samuel 18?
yeah, I believe so. There's one part where it says, does the Cushite know that he is dark skinned? Basically saying like that person can't help it that they're black is how it's been used
Okay.
to interpret. And it's a nasty interpretation that doesn't even make any contextual sense when you actually look at it, because at the time the person who wrote that would have been brown, not a white person.
Right.
And it wasn't looking at the actual skin color. It was making a reference to Cushites being pagans, and it was a religious comparison. But we take it so literally to mean, oh, does that person know that they have dark skin? And it's like, no, it was just saying that the Cushites had darker skin, and that was their identifier of if they were pagan or not. And so it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. And I just was really, really bothered by that. And at the same time, really took the time to sit in it and work through it. And other examples that I saw was how the feminist theology had been really weaponized and demonized. And you look at how women are treated in the Bible. And while there are some really great examples of women that are incredible, like Deborah, like Esther, like Ruth, there's all of these, heroic women. I can count on my hands the number of good examples of women in the Bible. I don't have time to count the good examples of men in the Bible.
Totally.
When you come across a good example of a woman, you're like, ooh, yay, here's one. And you're like, it shouldn't be a shock. It should be the normal. So anyways, but looking at that and realizing just it was so rare to come across a heroic positive depiction of women in the Bible that it had become trivialized and kind of like you really focused on these singular stories. And then it really bothered me that we couldn't figure out how to evolve from that. We evolved from separating our barley from our wheat. We don't do that anymore. We had no problem progressing from that. We had no problem allowing men to shave their beards. We had no problem with that one. And we had no problem with letting go of the whole child bride thing. We said, you know what, that's probably wrong. Like, it was a time and a culture. We get it. There was a time and place that this was normal, but maybe now is not the time to continue that. Why couldn't we do that with women's rights? Why couldn't we do that with, I don't know, slavery? The idea that the Bible was used to support slavery up until 90 minutes ago just baffles me. And it was something that what really baffled me was the Christian community's lack of desire to talk about it and look at scripture as something that is, to quote the Christian community's language, living and breathing. It's an ancient text that if you apply it literally to today, many of us would die. If a man sits on the bench of a woman who just was on her period, now he's got to go shower. I don't see us abiding by that rule. So this strange kind of picking and choosing. And I totally understand that there is the Old Testament's legalistic view that we had, we let go of. That is no longer the law that we abide by. You abide by the word of Jesus. But at the same time, there are these depictions and rules in the New Testament that no longer serve us, like the passage in 2 Timothy of women not being able to speak in church. This is what just doesn't really serve us anymore, because women couldn't speak in church because they couldn't read or write, and most of them were practicing pagan ideas that they were being influenced by in the home. Well, that's no longer the case. I can read and write, and I'm no longer influenced by the pagan ideas in the home. So not allowing it to breathe and really limiting it and almost calcifying it into 40 AD just seemed to be doing so much more harm than good. And I had a hard time with that, a really hard time wrestling with that. And that was another one of those things that really led me down this obsessive curiosity with Christianity. And I now really want to make it my mission to look at the faith from a respective, but not a participant, but a respectful observer, and say, hey, this book has a lot of good in it, but it's also been used to promote a lot of bad. And I'm not saying that you need to leave your faith. I'm saying if you want to hold on to your faith, I'm speaking to anyone who identifies as a Christian right now. If you want to hold on to your faith and it's important to you, you will hold it accountable for the people that have weaponized it. You will hold it accountable for the damage it's done and maybe some of the imperfections that exist within it. That doesn't mean you have to let it go. It's what it means to be a true fan of someone. If you're a true fan of a musician, you got to be able to admit when their album bombs, right? Like, oh, this wasn't your best. I love you so much, but this was not your best. And not to trivialize the Bible to, a discography of Taylor Swift, but it's one of those things where if you really love something, if you really love someone, you hold them accountable. And that doesn't mean that you have to abandon your faith. That doesn't mean that you're not a good person. That doesn't mean that you're not a Christian. And in fact, I would argue you are a better, more efficient and loving Christian if you are willing to look at your faith and say, have we been misinterpreting this passage? Can we let this breathe a little bit? What are you holding on to and what are you so afraid of that you have to take things so literally? What is literalism providing for you that faith in your God is not? Because if you can let go of that, if you have a true faith in your God, you can let go of that literalism and know that that text is going to breathe into 2023 and your faith in your God is not going to be sacrificed. And so that's really what I want to say and help Christians understand, and also be someone that can bridge the gap between Christians and non-Christians and say, this text, regardless of where you sit religiously, has had an immense influence on American culture, and we need to look at it. And that's what I try and do. And I hope that answered the question.
A little bit. Yeah, no, that was awesome. Thank you. I love the detail. I love the context. I love like your sentiment and what you want to communicate to who you're talking to. I loved that. It was so good. And I totally agree, man. We could just go on and on and on about the ways that this book has been taken out of context, interpreted literally, harmed people, supported and protected injustice and systems of oppression. Like, yeah, right, totally. We could go, that's a whole other, many episodes. But in the midst of your personal pulling this apart, navigating for yourself within whatever faith was for you, I want to ask a little bit more about the coping mechanism component of religion and how you see that playing out in people's lives. And then I would just want to say, so I don't forget, I also want to ask you about what you mean when you say the word spiritual. Like, what does that mean to you? Like, so I would love for you to answer either of those in whatever order, but like, I'm thinking about both those right now. I'm like, oh, I don't want to forget either one.
I say spiritual just simply to be inclusive. A lot of times people hear religion or religious, and that can really give a certain connotation. Mm-hmm. Spiritual for me just means you're acknowledging that there's something bigger out there beyond your understanding, and listening to that. That's all I really try and I don't really call myself a spiritual person. But there are moments when you're listening and you're recognizing and sitting in and acknowledging that there could be something bigger than me out there that I don't have the mental capacity to understand. And I'm willing to acknowledge that. And to me, that's a spiritual reflection. And meditating, prayer, reading scripture, all of these spiritual practices are connecting with, whether it's God, Jesus, Yahweh, Allah, whoever it is, you're acknowledging that there's something bigger than you, and you're sitting in the beauty and the humility of that. To me, that is what spirituality means. I've completely forgotten what your second question was. I think that was easier to answer, I'm going to be honest. So about using religion as a coping mechanism. Yeah. Well, this kind of goes back to, and this is just me nerding out, but the real origin of religion, that humanity, Homo sapiens, developed religion pretty early on. And I'm going to mess up the dates here, but I think it was around 10,000 years after Homo sapiens had been around, we started to develop religion. And that's really early considering we've been around for millions of years. There's the first, I could be wrong on those dates, just double check, but it's something like that. It's like 10, 15,000 years into Homo sapiens, we've started developing language and then religion. And there are many theories as to how and why that was. There's no way to know the real answer, but some theories are that we as Homo sapiens created religion as a way to create community. Because when you think about it, what we see in the evidence of Homo sapiens is that in our rudimentary early years, we were in groups of around 10 people, somewhere between 10 and then bigger groups might be 100. Those are really big groups. any bigger than that, and the group started to fray, and they started to develop conflict, and they couldn't really stay together in any sort of cohesive way, whether that was fights, people would create division, civil unrest in the desert, all after 100 people, the ability to stick together as one cohesive unit became really impossible. But then when we see religion enter the scene through some art and some artifacts, that some, limited evidence, but we start to see evidence of religion and acknowledgement of a higher power, the nomad groups expand to thousands of people. And that is because there was no longer one person in charge of 100 people. Thousands of people were listening to and reporting to, worshiping a god, an abstract idea. And because of that, there wasn't one person that was responsible for the group. If you were responsible for 100 people, you're not going to do a good job, right? You start to fray, you lose control. You're only one person. You can't manage the group. If thousands of people are worshiping and looking to authority and placing authority on something more ethereal and abstract, thousands of people can communicate with that God at once, right? So it's no longer one person, it's an ethereal being that everyone has access to. It's just a more efficient way of operating. And so that's one theory, and it's probably one of, paired with a couple of other theories. And another theory that a religion evolved and was created was to make sense of the unknown. We see this a lot with Egyptian writings and art. Some of their words and some of their cosmology is trying to make sense of why it rained and why they experienced droughts was because of the rain. We see this in Greek mythology a lot. Why did you not receive rain? Because the rain god didn't receive a sacrifice, right? So the drought didn't happen because of an environmental event that could be explained by science. It happened because the rain god didn't get what he wanted, because they didn't have access to the scientific understanding. So they created religion to make sense of the bad things that happened in life. And so those are two really big theories that fascinate me greatly. It's probably a combination of all. So this idea of religion being a coping mechanism for understanding and working through hardship is in our bones. It has been a survival tactic for millions of years for us. And I don't think that is wrong. I think that is survivalist. I think that is something that humanity needs. We need to believe that there is something bigger than us, because if it ends with us, bruh, it's scary. You're like, oh my God, oh my God, like that is what you're saying. It can't just be this. There has to be something bigger. Otherwise, this does not make sense. And it has to be something bigger. Otherwise, if I've lost my mom, am I never going to see her again? The idea of heaven provides this hope that I will see my mother again. And we need that in order to get through with our life. Being on earth is hard. And religion provides this hope that pushes us through and keeps us alive and keeps us surviving and procreating and contributing to the world. I don't think that is bad. I think that is one of the most beautiful parts of humanity, that we created religion, or we started worshiping and acknowledging things beyond our understanding as a way to just make it through life. To me, is a completing what it just encapsulates the human experience. And so that to me is where the idea of religion as a coping mechanism makes complete sense. And I think it is something that, if you are a Christian, if I was a Christian, I could totally see that as, and I respect this perspective, I could totally see that as affirmation that there is a God, that when times are hard, your body and your brain immediately turns you to something beyond your understanding, is one of the bigger evidences of a higher being that someone who is not Christian, can even admit. Now, that's pretty compelling evidence that when you are struggling, your body and your brain and your heart inherently turns towards something bigger than you, as just a biological reaction, is very compelling and beautiful to me. And so when I say coping mechanism, that's what I mean. I don't mean to trivialize it. like another coping mechanism. The one that I am really familiar with is retail therapy, and that is not as sacred. It's not effective, but looking at religion and turning to this spiritual idea of the world, to me, is a beautiful, beautiful example of what it means to be human.
Yeah. Wow. Cool. Thank you, Savannah. Wow.
Geek out a little bit on that.
I love it. Please geek out as much as you're willing to here. I love that. It was so interesting. Hi, Mike here. I just want to make sure you know that I'm a coach and a consultant. I specifically work with people through their queer journey or their religious baggage, and there's a link below this episode if you want to work with me. All right, let's get back to the episode. So personally, in the coping mechanism conversation, are you aware of a certain point in your own personal journey with, processing what's going on with your mom and clinging to like trying to find answers and your leaders telling you the Bible, religion, Jesus, whatever? At some point in that process, it sounds like there was enough healing or development or growth to the point where you didn't need religion to be what you needed it to be for that period that you were walking through. Is that accurate? And then what was the coming out of like popping your head out of the sand being like, oh, I actually don't need this anymore? What was that like in your thought process and perspective?
That is such a good question. And I don't ever think that I've thought about it that way, but I have two perfect kind of examples of something traumatic that happened to me where I found religion, and then something traumatic that happened to me where I was no longer a Christian and how I approached it. And so when my mom was diagnosed with lupus and we get that call in 9th grade of like, hey, there's a 30% chance she's not going to make it through the night. And I turned to religion because it's what I had been taught as like, hey, here's a resource. Oh yeah, there's that resource. Let me turn to that. Let me dive into that. That's how I found it and used it as a coping mechanism. When my mom died in October 2020, I think deep down, I had already had one foot out the door in faith. And I did not turn to faith to get me through that. I turned to therapy and I turned to my community. And I think one of the hardest parts, aside from my mom, the whole dying thing, but fair warning, I am not one to shy away from a dead mom joke. And that's just who I am. That is my coping mechanism. So, but I think one of all of your listeners are like, and I'm out. That honestly, if I'm really being honest, I've never shared this on a podcast before, but some of my close friends know this. One of the hardest parts of my mom's death was that the church were the least there for me. And I say this because I know that a lot of churches would handle that very, very well. And I'm thinking of one church in particular that I've worked at in the past. It's an incredible church. I know they would have handled it really well. And I know a lot of Christians that were there for me in that moment. I know a lot of other churches that reached out to me more than my church to walk me through this and offer us help. But the church that I was at the time, a couple of people on staff, when I showed up, said, hey, I'm so sorry for your loss, and gave me a hug, and it was never brought up again. I was 27 at the time. I had been on staff for 8 months. My mom had died, and the second day, my first day at work, it's hardly mentioned. And this is a bit of a trigger warning, but just for anyone who has gone through this or is going through it, again, never shared this on a podcast, but I think it's worth sharing. This is breaking news, new information. When my mom died, I was having severe suicidal thoughts for the first time in my entire life. And it was very scary. And it didn't last very long. It lasted about 2 months. And then it subsided, and we worked it out with, when I was experiencing it, the first thing I did was tell my dad and my stepmom, my husband and my best friend, tell some people about it so that it's out there and keep talking about it. But what I also did was I told my pastor, and he said, I think that's a result of grief, and I don't think that you need to worry too much about it. And then never brought it up again. Just never mentioned it. Sorry, my dog's getting really emotional with this story. She always does. And that to me goes back to what I was saying before, where I already had one foot out the door, seeing how my church at the time could not make room for my grief just made it that much easier. And so at that time, I couldn't use religion as a coping mechanism because my religious community was not helping me cope. No one, oh my God, Fern, relax. I know it's a very hard story, but we're going to get through it. Nobody at my church offered to bring me and Dimitri dinners. No one offered to come over and check on us. No one offered to help me out with my workload. I was still working and hustling and working at 2 different departments, and no one did anything. And it was just so hard. And for me, that was what made it easy for me to turn away from religion as a coping mechanism. When I thought, oh, this is, sure, God will always be there for me, but the boots on the ground people in my life that are religious, if this is how they're going to act when my mother dies, I don't need this, and I can't rely on it, and I can't trust it. And so while I know there are some most Christians and most churches have an amazing bereavement process for being there for when people have loss, at the time, my community didn't. And it made it that much easier for me to find other coping mechanisms. And I found really healthy ones. I went to therapy for like 6 months afterwards, or a year afterwards, to really work through it. I started meditating. I made it a point to talk regularly to a couple of my friends weekly about what was going on, just to have those kind of guideposts. So if you're listening and you're kind of on the fence of where you sit religiously and you're going through something traumatic, if your faith is not providing you with that relief and that coping mechanism and that hope that you need, that's okay, but you need to find something else that will, whether it's therapy, it should be therapy, or a tight friend group that you trust. Surround yourself with people that you want to be like in 5 years. Hold on to those people and fight for those relationships. Take some time alone. I took a 3-day trip, just myself in a cabin, like 6 months after my mom's death. And I just journaled, and I sat with myself and my thoughts. So that's what it looked like when religion was no longer a coping mechanism for me. I hate to say this, but my religious community at the time made it easy for me to find other sources because they themselves weren't a good source. And I know that's not everyone's experience, but that was mine. And yeah, I found other coping mechanisms that were healthy, and I definitely encourage others to do the same.
Yeah, totally. Savannah, thank you for sharing that. I'm honored that you'd share that for the first time here, but also just thank you for trusting all of us and being vulnerable there. Like, what a painful, like traumatizing time in your life. And especially like when you're talking about the church, not, the way that your church community responded, I can't help but empathize and get, a little bit like caught up in that myself. When I came out as gay, one of the more compelling reasons that drove me into deconstructing as hard as I did was I watched the Christians around me treat me the way they did, dehumanize me, alter our relationship instantly, all these weird defenses and like socially abhorrent, unspoken, nuanced, toxic behaviors that I had to interpret and figure out. And the silent treatment, the people who didn't check, like it was just it was shocking. And so I was like, if this is the result of the kinds of people that I've been part of in a faith community, and this is what love looks like in their life, this is like, I don't respect this. I don't honor this. I don't value this. I don't need this, right? Like a lot of what you said, I was like, oh my God, different reason, but absolutely the same experience. It was awful on a human level, just basic love, basic compassion. Like they were bankrupt. And I was like, this is off. And the awkward thing was like, I was these people. I didn't respond in the same way they didn't respond to me. There are lots of people who went through their versions of trauma and horrible events in their lives. And I was these people to those people. This is horrible. And I was just so aware of like how shallow and like crusty what I was calling love actually was, and how performative it was and conditional. It was awful and like sobering and embarrassing. And so the work that I went into to just pull apart, how did we get here? How do we talk about these things in these ways? How are our consciences fine with this behavior? Like it was jarring and horrible. And so like, I'm like, I think you're being generous. I think a lot of church communities function the way I experienced mine. I hope that I'm wrong, but I've been in church my whole life. I've been a part of a few different church communities. There are patterns and symptoms to the way we related to and responded to things that were uncomfortable, specifically like grief and loss. We weren't, in a lot of those communities, we weren't great. Like I wasn't great, but we weren't great. I think a big part of why I wasn't great at that was because I wasn't really shown how to, or what it looked like to genuinely care for, you know, people in these really painful seasons of life. So I guess my point in all that is like, oh, I hear you. I experienced my version of that. It was one of the most compelling things for me to feel like ethically I had to dive deeper into where this was coming from. What is wrong with us? What is this cancer that I'm seeing come
Yes.
up in these people that I thought loved Jesus and were following in the footsteps of Christ? And, you know, I'm like, this
Right.
is not the answer. These people are not what they're saying they are. We are duped. Like, we're fooling ourselves barely. We're not tricking anybody else. Like, this is, you know, so that's like, I'm just not kind of reacting at this point now to what you just shared. I'm like, am I triggered right now? Like, my God, I'm sorry that that's how you were treated in such a like terrible season of your life. Like, you definitely deserve better. You know, I know you don't need to hear this from me, but I just need to respond to that. My God, this is horrible.
I definitely appreciate, and I appreciate you listening and holding space for that story, because I feel like a lot of people can resonate with it. And it's one of those things. The biggest lesson that I learned in that season was it's easy to be a good Christian when everything's fine. It's easy to be a nice person when no one around you needs anything.
Right.
Right? It's harder to be a nice person when someone says, "Hey, my mom just died. We need food." Like D's struggling. He's working full time. He's also working freelance. I can't, get out of bed. I'm struggling. I'm trying to do work and then come home. Like, just bring us dinner, or come hang out with us because I'm depressed. And, in marriage, if you've ever lost a parent in the marriage, how does the spouse that is supporting the grieving spouse, like, no one was there, and we were crying for help and no one would listen. And you think that's when it's hard to be a nice person, when someone is asking you for your time and someone's asking you to break your routine and be interrupted and sit in an emotion, sit in my grief, even though you don't know how to respond to it. Be that uncomfortable silence, that uncomfortable, crunchy dialogue of how to be comforting in grief. That's when it's hard to be a kind person, is when more than what you're willing to give is being asked of you. And I think the Christian community really struggles with that because it is so legalistic and regimented. Like, you have your church on Wednesday, you have your church on Sunday, and you go to small group and you read your Bible. But the minute someone needs you to break that routine and not go to Wednesday church and instead go sit with someone on the street because they went through a breakup and they don't know how to move on with their life, when you have to do that instead of your Wednesday routine, that's where we lose. That's where people step out. It's in those moments when Christians aren't willing to step away from their routine and their schedule and their comfort to sit in the pain of the inevitable human experience, that people walk away from the church. And it's really sad. And I say that to any Christians listening, to say, if there's anything I want you to know, it's that I respect your religion and your faith and your God and the story of Jesus. And I hope that this story helps Christians just better understand how pivotal of a role that you can play in someone's life when they're in pain, if you're just willing to break up your routine and step into that pain and sit with them. It means the world. And I think we'd see an increase in church participation and community if more Christians were willing to do so.
Totally agreed. Jeez. Preach. Okay, so in the vein of grief and loss and processing that, and Christians and their participation and all that, I've got strong feelings about, like, oh, Christians don't seem to know how to do this or can't seem to show up in these ways. I'm wondering, from your observation, like, kind of from the vantage point of being on the outside looking in, kind of observing Christianity as the separate entity from you, what are things you're observing or witnessing in the culture, the dogma, the doctrine, the theology that's conditioning Christians to be bankrupt in these pivotal moments, in these practical, genuine ways of actually caring for the least of these, for people who are going through a hard time? Do you see anything from, the clinical, taking a step back and observing cause and effect, to that being the result in the Christians? Yeah.
And I want to answer this as best I can, because that is such a great question. What I know and what I'm seeing is that it's not what the church or the faith or religion is doing. It's what it's not doing and what it hasn't been doing. And that is looking at its past influence and reconciling the damage it's done. And I think the church specifically evangelical communities or Christian nationalists, those are another topic for another day. But if you identify as either of those groups, I think those groups have a really hard time looking at how the Bible has been used in the past and looking at it and admitting that maybe it wasn't always used for the best purposes, and speaking that and saying this was used incorrectly and we want to do better. I think the Christian community has a hard time doing that, because for them to do that, and this is just what I'm seeing, and after talking with some people in the Christian community that are in this space, talking about what I'm seeing, from a clinical perspective, what I'm seeing is the reason that the Christian community has a hard time looking at how the Bible and Christianity has been used negatively in the past and made negative influences. The reason they struggle with that is because they interpret doing that as abandoning their faith, when what it really is enriching and bettering your faith. Mm. And that goes with anything, like we were saying before, someone who can look to their past and say, you know what? I wasn't really there for my kids growing up with them. I worked, came home late. I never saw my kids. Now that they're older, I'm going to spend more time with them. I'm going to do better. I'm going to apologize to my kids and say, I'm sorry that I wasn't there. And I can't change the past. And I cannot go back in time and change it. But what I can do is change the course right now and be better. You're going to have a lot more respect for that parent than the parent who says, well, I was never there in the past, so I'm just going to keep doing that, because if I change what I'm doing, then I'm just not a good parent. I'm going against my word of what I've been doing. We'd be like, what? What are you talking about? Just because you've been doing it that way doesn't mean that it's the right way. Just because it's a tradition doesn't mean it's a good thing. So I see a lot of people doing this well. See a lot of Christians, a lot of deconstruction Christians, a lot of Christians that are more conservative or more liberal. I see people doing this, looking to the past, recognizing it, and doing better. I do see that happening, but it's not the general consensus. It's not the general attitude or actions of the church. And until it is, the church is going to continue to have a disconnect with culture and continue to be rigid and seen as legalistic by those that aren't direct participants in it. And the church really has to, the Christian community, if you're a Christian and you are listening to this, I want you to know that you looking to your faith and saying, ooh, us using the Bible to defend slavery, or us using the Bible to defend the idea that being gay is wrong, those aren't matching what it means to be loving and inclusive. Can we reevaluate those passages and look at that a little bit deeper? Am I willing to be uncomfortable and maybe correct what I've been taught and be better for my future kids? Christians listening, if you do that, you gain so much more respect for the people in your community and the people outside of it. If you want to be a true evangelical, which means to go out and spread the word, if you want to do that, you've got to be willing to look at your own flaws and be willing to wrestle with them and reconcile them. And that's the big pattern that I'm seeing, is that looking at your past and correcting it, course correcting in the present to make for a better future, that's seen as abandoning your faith and not being loyal to the Bible and not being loyal to your God. And that's just not what it is. And the reality is the Christian community has been able to do that in the past, and looking at incorrections and harmful interpretations and ideologies, course correcting and doing better. You doing that today, you'll not be the first one. It's not a novel idea. It's how faith and religion progresses. So retrospectively looking at your past, seeing how you can be better for the future, that's what it means to be a person of faith, in my eyes. And I'm not one to make that definition, for everyone, but you will gain a better audience and a better hearing with those outside of the church if you're willing to look at the own plank in your eye, to use your language, pluck it out before you go calling out the sins of others. And that's a big trend that I see, and it's all because of that misdefinition. And it really actually is really sad to me when I see people think that they're abandoning their faith if they question it or they acknowledge something bad or crunchy in the Bible. I point it out all the time that the Bible contradicts itself literally all the time. And people say, I can't believe in God if he contradicts himself. I'm like, that's not true. The Bible contradicts itself because it was written over thousands of years. What's the bigger truth of the Bible? Don't get hung up on the legalism, and be willing to look at where things were crunchy and learn to interpret them more fluidly. So that's my soapbox on that. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, oh yeah. Love it. Thank you. Totally. I want to ask you this. This wasn't a question. I have a question I want to ask you, but right before I ask that, I wanted to just insert this. Would you mind providing, because I'm just hearing some of my listeners, their wheels are turning. I want to like kind of give them voice here. When you say the Bible contradicts itself all the time, would you mind providing a couple of like just blunt examples that they can just wrestle with, that, it's not your opinion. They're like, oh God, yeah.
Absolutely. So, and a lot of these are on my reels on my Instagram too, if you want to go back and look at them, just for anyone that wants to go back. So a great example that I always use is like it says, love your neighbor as yourself, right? But then it's eye for an eye. So those are completely different ideas. Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. But in the Old Testament, we're told if someone does something to you, you do it to them. Those are completely different messages. And if you look at them on the surface, you're like, oh my God, those really contradict themselves. Those are exactly opposite messages, but they were written for different purposes. The eye for an eye was written in the Old Testament to establish some sense of order, right? And this is to keep people from being violent towards each other. It's their version of a justice system. And then in the New Testament, it's an example of the gospel, and what it means to love people is to love them as you'd love yourself. And so those are two different contexts and audiences. So while on the surface they contradict each other, there's a reason for it, and that's okay. But then there are some more direct contradictions that don't make sense. And we see this a lot in Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. I believe it's in 1st and 2nd Kings where it says, in chapter 6 or something, it says, and all of this is in my reels for the exact chapters and verses. I don't have the exact verse memorized, but I believe it's in chapter 6 of 1st Kings. It says, all of the Canaanites were wiped out entirely. And then the next chapter, the Canaanites were walking around, and you're like, wait, didn't we just kill all of them? Didn't we literally just kill all of them? And now you're saying that they're walking about the land and they're fighting back. So we were just told that there was not a Canaanite left alive. And one of the versions, it's like, and not a soul was left alive. And then 3 chapters later, it's like the Canaanites are fighting back. And you're like, those don't make sense. And the reason for that is it's war literature, and historical documents in ancient Near Eastern literature were not historical documents like we think about them. They're not focused on numbers, dates, and characters. They're focused on the big movements. And the author saying that all the Canaanites were killed, not a soul was left alive, is like saying it's raining cats and dogs. It's just exaggerated language to say we beat the Canaanites. And in the next chapter, when they start fighting back, and readers would have picked up on that at the time. That's language, that's war literature language. It's telling the story of an actual war that most likely happened, but it's packaging it in a entertaining story that the readers, because remember, they don't have books, so these stories have to be passed down orally. So they have to make the story of this battle really entertaining, and using language like that. Not a soul was left alive. All of the Canaanites were slaughtered. It's just a way of saying that the Israelites had a victory over the Canaanites, and they won maybe by a lot. And then a few chapters later, we read about the Canaanites fighting back. Our modern ears hear that and we immediately get confused and say, or maybe, we kind of skim over it and we don't directly pick up on it. But when you look at it, that can be really confusing. But if you take the time to understand the genre of this is a historical narrative, it's a war narrative that is using metaphors and language that was easy to memorize. They were creating a story about this battle that could be passed down for generations. You've got to make it entertaining. You've got to use colorful language, bright metaphors, and exaggerations. It doesn't mean there's no element of truth. And I cannot emphasize that enough. Just because something isn't literally accurate, literal, doesn't mean that it doesn't have truth. Just look at the parables. When Jesus mentions parables, we know that those aren't true. They're parables, but there's an element of truth in them that we're supposed to pick up on. Same with First and Second Kings. The overarching narrative of that is listen to your God through trial and war, and God will be there for you. And God is there for the Israelites as they go into battle. He's the wind in the trees. She's the presence as they go onto the battlefield. And so that's the message. When you get hung up on those nitty-gritty details, you come across these conflicts and contradictions that can be really confusing. And it's really hard to stick to a faith if all you're doing is interpreting the word literally, because it's just not going to work. It's not going to work because it's going to contradict itself all the time. But if you can let that text breathe, let the genre breathe. That's what I always say. Let the genre be what it wants to be. It's a war story. The author intended to tell this really great story about this battle. Let it be that. It doesn't have to be a literal historical document. It's not. And when you try and make it that, you're only hurting the scripture and missing out on the actual interpretation. So when it comes to contradictions, don't let that deter you from pursuing your faith. Don't let that ruin your relationship with God. Let it be a call to action to dig deeper into that genre, into that book, and you will be surprised what you discover. And you'll probably even feel closer to your God and your faith when you unpack those different layers of that text, because each layer is very beautiful.
So good. Yes, Savannah. Yes. Thank you. Wow. Brilliant. Okay. I know I need to land this plane. I just want to keep hearing you talk more and more. So I want to ask you one more big question and then we'll land this. You mentioned a bit ago, at some point, I think when we were in the coping mechanism part of the conversation, you said something to the effect of, I don't need a savior, or I don't, so the whole notion, so Christians listen to you are like, oh, it just probably with that statement alone would just distance you immediately, right? Because you're like suggesting that you're not a sinner. And John warns, if anyone says they're without sin, right, they're deceived. Right. And so, so that all that just kind of already gets cluttered. I would just love to give you the opportunity to respond to the defense mechanism coming up for Christians, probably, right? When you say, I don't need a savior, when you're suggesting that you don't need to be forgiven for sins you've committed, you didn't need Jesus to be crucified on your behalf. They're going to take that as like, oh, I mean, you said you're not a Christian, so fine, but whoa, you're just so far away from what I understand to be empirical truth. Would you care to speak to people who are thinking or hearing you in that lens?
Well, first of all, I don't need to account for my sins because I've never sinned. So just kidding. I'm just kidding. I'm the biggest sinner of us all. Let's be honest. According to most people that leave comments on my reels, I'm going to hell and far worse. So
well, I don't want to high five you over that.
What I do want to say, all jokes aside, is if you feel distant from me because I don't align with what you believe, that's on you. And I don't mean that harshly. I just mean I can't control how you feel about what I believe, and you can't change what I believe. Only you can change what you believe. Only I, Savannah, can decide what I believe. And if that makes you uncomfortable, I can't fix that for you. That is a personal journey. And what I would respond to is, what I would reply is, why is it that you feel distant from me? Why is it that because I don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah, why does that make you uncomfortable? Is it because you feel like you need to save me and you know that you can't? Is it because I'm questioning things that you feel like you've never been able to question but secretly have been questioning? Is it because I feel really comfortable in where I believe, but what I believe, but maybe you don't feel super comfortable and you're pushing down those questions? Is it sheer frustration because I'm different from you? And I would say lean into that uncomfortability, because the reason you feel uncomfortable, that's work that you have to do. I know what I believe and I'm comfortable in it. I feel fine in it. And I'm comfortable with what you believe as a Christian, and I'm fine with that. And I love you for that. Why can you not offer me the same love and understanding that I'm offering you? Why is that? It could be different reasons, but trying to sit in that answer, that question, and find the answer to that. Say, if we both think differently, I'm comfortable in what I believe, and I'm not offended by what you believe. But if you're comfortable in what you believe, but you're offended by what I believe, why? And that's okay. It doesn't bother or affect me that you think I'm going to hell. And I don't mean that in an offensive or abrasive way. I have to think that way. If I didn't believe in Jesus, but then felt really, really sad and convicted when people told me I was going to hell, then I wouldn't really be an agnostic person. And I don't believe in hell. It doesn't really, your fear for my damnation doesn't have the same emotional threatening attitude on me that you think it does, because I don't believe in the same systems and reality that you do. And that's okay. That's totally okay. I'm okay in that uncomfortableness. I sit in this uncomfortableness all day. But some people don't, and that's normal. I think that's totally normal, and I welcome that. I welcome those conversations. And I would just say, if you feel whatever you're feeling right now, I think sit in it and say, what am I feeling? Is it frustrated? Is it doubt in my own faith? Is it fear that if I listen to Savannah too long, then I'm going to lose my faith? You're not. That's not how that works. If you are a committed Christian, lean into that. Don't abandon that, but hold space for your questions. The more you ignore your questions and emotions, and the more that you pretend that everything is fine, the more it will become not fine. And the more those questions will come up and ferment in you, and they will bother you. Lean into the questions, lean into it. Be okay not knowing things. I've said this on podcasts before, but don't be in a rush to find the answer. Enjoy the journey. And if I frustrate you, that is work on your end that needs to be done. It's not something I need to do to make you feel better. That's not how that works. And that's not how humanity works. Otherwise, if it was my responsibility to make everyone around me feel better, I would just never leave my house and I would never do anything. And neither would anyone else. Our goal is not to make everyone around us feel better. Our goal is to figure out what makes us feel like us, and how people react to that is their own choice. And you are only responsible for your own actions and reactions. So lean into the why behind that, and don't be afraid to explore it.
Nice. Okay, I want to push on that a little bit. If you were devout and Christian for, years of your life, how did you come out from under the sin nature, need Jesus, right? Like, how did you, because that's such a harrowing, threatening, persistent presence within Christian doctrine, right? Like,
Yes.
How did you all of a sudden stop being threatened by, I know like the hell thing easily dismissed, but sin just seems to be such a sticky, obsessive thing that Christians will not like they almost believe in sin and the devil more than Jesus sometimes, almost, right? In their attitude. Yeah. What was that like for you?
Well, first off, I love that you said when you came out as non-Christian, because I have referred to it as my coming out before. And please know that I don't mean that in a way to try and take away from that phrase or dilute it. It just, the metaphor is perfect of it's similar to coming out as gay, in that everyone around me thought that I was Christian. They thought I was some type of way for so long. My lifestyle suggested I was a certain way. And then I come out as a different way. And they're like, oh, I thought you were, maybe that makes sense. Actually, that does make sense. That, okay. It's like, oh, you're gay. That makes sense. Okay. Yep. Now it all makes sense. So it's similar. So it's just funny that you use that language, because
I didn't even notice.
We use that language all the time of my coming out as not Christian, as more agnostic. As far as sin, I can't think of a time where I actually believed in sin. And I know that that's crazy, but again, remember, I did not grow up in the faith. I came to faith later on in life at around 17, 18. And I don't know what it was about. I think a lot of it was my upbringing. I had fantastic parents that talked about right and wrong in a non-theological way. When you do something wrong, you need to be held accountable for it. And the reason you do it is because of human desire and human imperfection. That doesn't mean it's okay. It just explains the why behind it, and you need to do better. My parents were really good at discipline and painting a clear picture of what it meant to be a good contributing member of society. So I already had a really strong understanding of moral and ethics, that the idea of sin just kind of fell flat on me. It just kind of bounced off of me. I even went, oh my God, this reminds me, when I was at the last church I was at, I had one of the best bosses ever. He was just incredible. And I just the best boss, because I went into his office. He was a pastor at the time, and walked in, and I said, I won't say his name. We'll call him Bob. I was like, Bob, I don't think I believe in sin. don't understand it. It doesn't make sense to me. This was in summer of 2020. I mean, this was like 2.5 years ago. And he was like, shut the door. Shuts the door. And he was like, look, I don't think I do either. Or something like that, something to the extent of like, hey, I get what you're saying. And he was just, we were the same mind. He was me like 15 years in the future. Just, I admire him to this day. I mean, just an incredible, intelligent person that was willing to wrestle with things. And he said, tell me what you're thinking. And I kind of explained to him a little bit. I was like, it just doesn't make sense. The world is built on order and science and things. The reason a flower grows towards the sun is so that it can get the energy it needs, the photosynthesis to make it, like everything just makes sense. Trees, gravity, trees grow up, the leaves fall down, like everything just makes sense. Where is the HR office that is monitoring sin? Like the reason things happen in the world is because of survival, right? Like I said, plants lean towards the sun to survive. And when we in nature, like with rain, the soil, the rain is soaked up, it goes through a whole system of irrigation. I mean, everything just works to survive and keep the world running. Sin just seems to be this extra layer of work that has no actual benefit. This was how I was imagining it and talking it out to my boss. So I'm using really brash language because that's what I was feeling.
Yeah.
And, I was saying, when I do something wrong, you mean God is keeping a tally, or he's saying that's wrong? And if you do enough wrong things and you don't believe in Jesus, you're going to go to hell. I said, who's doing all the administrative work for that? Who's upkeeping hell and dividing people? Like, oh, God's doing it. Why? Why? At the end of the day, you're dead. Why do you need to stay in hell? Like, there's no way you're going to like go back and redo and learn from your mistakes. It's done. The damage is done. Why are you in hell? And why are you staying there? And like, is there an option to get to heaven? The whole point of it being this idea of heaven and hell, and whether or not you had done a certain number of things right or wrong determined where you were going to go, went against every line of logic of mine in terms of science. I was like, that's just a waste of energy to have those two spaces, and then some being having to divvy up and make tallies and create an algorithm for who's messed up how many times. But they believe in Jesus, so they did mess up, but they did kill their brother. So even though they believe in Jesus, they still need to go to hell. Who's doing that? Where's the HR? What HR head is running this? And my boss was just cracking up, and he was like, all valid questions. And, he broke it down for me from a theological perspective. He's like, a lot of Christians believe it in this way, and that sin is you acknowledging your own mistakes and reconciling that or not. And it's the non-reconciling that can lead to eternal damnation. And, so it was explaining these theological ways. But for me, I had never been fully invested in the idea of sin. And in my mind, I was like, I do good things and I try not to do bad things, because that's what makes life better for me and for everyone else. And that's it. The reason that I don't, I was going to say kill people, but we don't kill people. That's an extreme mentality, and some days you want to. But the reason that I don't, cheat on my taxes isn't because I'm afraid of going to hell. It's because I don't want to get audited and go to prison. And that made so much more sense to me. And yeah, so the long answer short is, the reason I was able to let go of the concept of sin is because I never really had a firm grasp on what it was in the first place, and continued to question it my entire time as a Christian. And yeah, and I had some really great people to walk me through it. And at the end of the day, it was something I could easily let go of. And I know that's not everyone's journey, and a lot of people struggle with it and maybe suffer from like a legalistic mentality around it, and the checking the box of like, how many good things did you do? I suffer from OCD. I have for most of my life since I was about 7. So I totally get it. It's just not something I personally struggled with, so I won't pretend to. And yeah, I look at sin as just something that confuses and baffles me to no end, and I can never make sense of it. And that's just me being honest. And I know it makes sense for a lot of people, and I'm not trying to take that from you, and I respect you for that. It just doesn't make sense to me. Never has. maybe one day I'll wake up and feel like a terrible person from all the sin. But for right now, I'm just trying my best. And I do good and I try to avoid bad simply because it's the right thing to do.
Mm,
Ethically, it makes my life easier and it makes other people's lives easier. So
nice. Cool. Thank you. I would say also that's like a very unique journey through
yes,
Christianity that is so uncommon.
yes,
That's awesome. I'm so happy for you. My God, you didn't have to go through all of the,
I
I can't
know.
tell you how much emotion has been spent on over sin and forgiveness and in my life personally, let alone all the people, yeah, just dodge a bullet on that. That's awesome. Okay. Well, Savannah, listen, I've had you on here sharing. Thank you for investing the time and energy. I got to land this plane, but I do want to make sure people know what is available in your world they can plug into. Where do they find you? How do they become a follower, a client, a supporter, whatever, in all the ways? Please tell us, how do people participate in your world?
Love that. Thank you so much for allowing for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can follow me on Instagram, Savannah Ray Carreno. That's where all of my reels are on the Bible and looking at the
Which, by the
Bible.
way, these reels are quality, y'all. She's putting quality work. Like, her reels are not the same as other people's reels. This is like education in like 1 minute form. It's amazing. I cannot endorse her reels enough. Go follow her on Instagram. Sorry.
I'm not a regular mom. I'm a cool mom. I do try and mix it up. So I do like educational reels and then I'll do some funny ones just to like make light of this very dark world that we live in. But the captions are always where all of the citations and the information are. So that's where you can find me, Savannah Ray Carreno. You can also follow Please Elaborate. That's in my bio as well. If you're wanting to get involved with that, just follow Please Elaborate. We'd love to have you. We have a mailing, a newsletter that goes out. We're launching next month. A bi-weekly newsletter where we give public speaking and communication tips and how to talk about and navigate really challenging topics. So if that's something of your interest, just follow us there. That's where, if you also want to do our 8-week public speaking and communications intensive, where we walk through how to present your ideas and tell your story in a succinct way, build your brand or your voice, increase and improve your public speaking in the corporate world. You can sign up for that over there as well. But just would love to have you come by, come hang and DM me. Would love to have a conversation. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love it. Cool. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much for being here. And everyone, I'll put the links and things in the show notes below so you can easily find Savannah there. But yeah, go get the things, follow Savannah, let your life be enriched by the beautiful quality work she's putting out there. Excellent content. Like, she gets a gold star for being a content creator. Yeah, it's so good. You do such a good job. And I don't know if people who aren't making that kind of content realize the level of work that it goes into creating those kinds of pieces for such a short, anyway, you just do such a great job. The excellence and quality is just top notch. It's so good. I'm so impressed. Yeah, for sure. Savannah, thank you so much for being here. Everyone go check out Savannah. Thanks for being here. We'll see you at our next episode. Thank you for watching. As always, the pertinent links from the episode are below. I also have coaching and consulting available for you, as well as facilitated groups you might be interested in. You can find information about any of that with the first link below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.